everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, Rob, it's Diana.
And it's me, Jackie.
Sometimes we do little bits and whatnot, but I want to get started on today's topic because honestly, given the precautions about travel, I think we're going to talk about elopement tonight. And I think the idea of people grabbing their significant other, going across state lines, running away from their families who don't approve to get married, it's just not safe in this time. So we're going to talk about elopement. And I have a real problem with all this elopement going on.
Rob,
it's not what?
I think you may have missed it.
Elopement. It's when two people, they're like their family. It's like a Romeo and Juliet situation, and they flee across the border. Maybe
Star-crossed lovers. We're not doing that.
What are we doing?
No, entirely different.
This isn't a podcast about marriage and how to prepare for your marriage.
It is not.
Well, what do we do here?
It's a podcast about behavior analytic research.
Oh yeah. It's coming back to me now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, so we're going to talk about elopement. The problem behavior elopement, it sounds like.
Totally different.
So I'm not prepared for this at all. So I really hope that we have a super special guest on the line who can help us with that, perhaps who has done multiple research studies on the topic of elopement, because I have like 30 pages of notes, but they are not going to help us with our behavior analytic research podcast, I think.
Rob, cantaloupe.
Who are you calling a cantaloupe, Melonhead? Thank goodness. I was wondering if I was going to have to put that in.
Wow, guys, that was like the best bit I've heard in a while.
Super special guest, please introduce yourself. Well, actually, I'll introduce you, and then you tell us all about yourself. We are very lucky. We do have a special guest who is an expert in elopement in the behavior analytic sense, and that is Dr. Megan Boyle. Megan, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Even after the bit?
Yeah, I was like trying to muffle my laughter. I was dying. That was so funny.
Oh, thank you. Okay, good. Whew.
She feels obligated.
I just keep waiting for someone's mic to cut off.
Yeah.
What show did I agree to be on? No, thank you. Oh, well, so Megan, I lied. I'm a little bit prepared for this conversation, but we are incredibly fortunate to have you on tonight because you have done lots of research on the topic of elopement. I was saying to Diana before we got on the line that this might be the first time we have a guest and we have 3 articles to discuss. And we have the author of all 3 of the articles. Because usually we'll have someone will come on and they'll have 2 of the 3 articles and they'll have a good background information one. But I think this is the first time every single article has your name right on it, right there in big letters, which is very exciting.
You've been working hard, Megan.
You have. I work really hard, Jackie.
Woo.
Good. We're glad we have you here then. But before we start talking about elopement, Megan, why don't you tell the audience all about yourself?
Sure. So I'm an associate professor at Missouri State University. I was trained in the assessment and treatment of severe behavior in my doc program at Utah State. I've done some early intervention here and there, but my research interests are broadly how can we improve the assessments and treatments that we have for severe behavior. I'm really into schedule thinning, playing around with functional analysis formats. I do a lot with functional analysis because I'm a problem behavior researcher, and so that kind of lends me into doing a lot of FAs.
And that definitely, I think, came through in the research. I usually like to read my research articles in chronological order when I have a few of them to read. Mm-hmm. And I totally heard your methodology story in terms of everyone. It's what if we added this to the FA? Or what if this component were added in? Or how could we do this a little bit more efficiently? Or can we take out some of the more aversive components of this treatment? So that really came through with kind of the line of the narrative of the research. I like to have a story in my research too. So it was a lot of fun to read your articles.
That's awesome. And it's funny because my students, I do all of my research with my students. I couldn't do my work without them. And we kind of joke that there should be some kind of montage with me saying well, what if we did this? What about this? Or I have an idea. Just because I'm all over the place when I'm running these sessions. And I mean, it helps to know the literature really well and to know what's been done and what's out there already. But when you're, doing this work as it's happening, you kind of have to just go with, your gut and what you're thinking might be best.
It's very true. So let's get started by sharing what 3 articles we will be discussing tonight. So we have 3 here. Surprise, surprise. If you hadn't picked up, these are all written by Dr. Megan Boyle, as well as a cavalcade of other folks. So we'll be discussing Systematic Review of Functional Analysis and Treatment of Elopement, parentheses, 2000-2015, by Dr. Boyle and Adamson from Behavior Analysis and Practice, 2017. Treatment of Elopement Without Blocking with a Child with Autism, by Dr. Boyle, Keenan, Forck, and Curtis from Behavior Modification, also 2017. And a very recent article evaluating a treatment without extinction for elopement maintained by access to stereotypy by Dr. Boyle, Bacon, Brewer, Carton, and Gaskill from the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis 2020.
By the way, Rob, every time I say 2020 now, I say it that way in like my real life, and it's hilarious.
I've incepted you. I'm very excited about
2020.
So why don't we start where we always love to start here on the show, by defining elopement? Because if you don't make good definitions, you could do an entire podcast about the problem of, running away to get married, which is what we were about to do. But luckily we realized the mistake, which I don't take any responsibility for. It was someone else's fault, I think. So Megan, how do you like to define elopement as someone who did the systematic review of all the papers defining elopement?
So the most common way that people define it is just leaving an area without permission. So it's super broad. Sometimes people will subdivide that into bolting and wandering. So bolting as in running away, and then wandering as in kind of just walking or meandering away. Sometimes there's a distance requirement. That's the one I particularly like using when I'm running sessions for whatever reason. So like if it's a few feet or a few meters away from a therapist, they'll define it that way too.
I love that your definition has to talk about while the subject is awake. I like that you added that in to your review, that, elopement can't be considered elopement if they're sleeping.
Yes, that was something that we had to add in during our review. I didn't know that we had to put that caveat in there, but then we were getting articles on like sleepwalking. And so we didn't want to include that in the review. So that we're like, oh, P.S., they have to be awake.
There could be some similar safety concerns with sleepwalking as there could be with elopement. But I can see how you might want to categorize that different. But that's one of the main concerns why we would address elopement, right? Because you could sort of hear this and maybe not know a lot about it and say, well, it should be okay for someone to be able to walk around on their own, right? But very often there is a safety component we need to be concerned about. So someone who may not be aware of their surroundings or recognize the potential danger in being near cars or near streets, right? And that's why we need to address.
Yeah, for sure. I think ideally we would be able to allow a child some kind of latitude or leniency, walking around on their own. But unfortunately, a lot of our kids will like leave the house or, run across the street or, like you said, get into trouble, safety related issues.
So when you were looking at the research on elopement, only from 2000 to 2015, because that's your area of expertise. If we go too far back, it could get confusing, I suppose. What was the prevalence of elopement behavior? Because it is one of those, kind of problem behaviors that I know in my own practice, I don't see that often. It's usually more the danger of the elopement that is the concern. But like, how often is this kind of labeled as a problem by families of individuals with disabilities?
So I did another quick review yesterday, actually, to see if there was any updated information. And I had to kind of combine findings from a few different surveys. And it depends on the population or the nature of the people that you're talking about. So I've seen figures as high as 50% of children with autism, at least at some point in time, have engaged in elopement.
That's pretty high and a little bit scary, right?
Yes, it's a crazy high number. If you add in people with other disabilities and you add in adults, that figure goes down to 5%. So if you're looking at just a clinical population, children and adults, a variety of disability types, that figure decreases. So kind of regardless of the review, I found it's higher in children compared to adults, and it's higher with autism compared to other developmental disabilities.
Now, did they speak to the safety concern of elopement, or was it really just the broadly defined of this has occurred in the past versus this occurred and there was injury or there was a traffic accident involved? I know that kind of comes up a lot of like, what if my child leaves the house and they're going to run out in the street? That would be sort of most parents' sort of number one concern with elopement, or they're going to go get lost.
Some of the reviews have just focused on the prevalence of elopement in and of itself or compared to other topographies of problem behavior. But then some get into, what are the ramifications of elopement when it does happen? So there was a 2012 review by Anderson et al., and they found that about 50% of the children that did elope became missing or experienced traffic injury or drowned. So pretty severe ramifications when elopement does occur.
It does seem like that it is fairly prevalent when you look at the news, right? So if you ever get like Google notifications and one of them is like autism, like most days it's like someone's missing because they left their house, right? And
yeah,
it's just really sad.
Kind of in the early days of the show, I know I would try to post something every day on social media. And so I had the Google Hot keywords, and every single day there was at least one story of usually it was like individual found after a few hours, but it was always an individual with autism or with some other type of disability who had gotten lost or had left their residence. And you'd get a lot of those articles. And it was just so sad to see this still, continuing to be a problem. I mean, I guess it's not going to just suddenly stop being a problem, I guess. But it was just really sad that this is a continuing concern. So, Megan, when it comes to elopement research, was this a problem behavior that just you saw a need for there to be more research on when you were, in school, when you were doing your own work? Or was this a matter of, specific, you sought this out? And this was something that was a fascinating problem behavior in terms of how do we do an FA on a problem behavior that just inherently doesn't exactly lend itself to I'll just read the old Iwata paper and I should be fine on assessing this and treating this problem behavior?
That's a fun question because in my position at Missouri State, I have an autism clinic. When I say an autism clinic, I mean one clinic room. And we have one-way mirror and then an observation room. And so I'm able to conduct applied research in a really controlled setting. I'm really fortunate in that way. And how my research agenda has kind of morphed is I've got these long-term research projects, applied research projects. And so I recruit participants who fit a certain set of criteria. And then along the way, while we're conducting this longer term project, I try to address some clinical issues that are affecting the family. And at the time, there were several children that I worked with whose caregivers reported that they were eloping, they were bolting. And I realized that, I'd worked with aggression and property destruction, negative vocalization, self-injury, but I had never worked with elopement before. And we kind of had a little joke in my doc program whenever we would do an intake, and elopement was one of the topographies that we talked about, kind of hoping that a caregiver wouldn't say they wanted to target elopement. None of us had ever done that. And so I hadn't done that. And so I was like, okay, well, what do? I go to the research. I go to the literature. And so, of course, I found the Piazza et al. 97 paper on elopement. And so if anyone out there is interested in this topic, that's an amazing paper. And then I was looking for lit reviews specifically with, recommendations on how to arrange functional analyses of elopement. And I found that there wasn't one. There was a lit review on treatment, which was interesting to me that there wasn't one on assessment also, and so we were like, okay, well, in this reviewing of literature, which I need to do as a practitioner, I might as well make it, publishable so that I can share this information with other people.
So clever. I'm just going to follow you around for a few days, I think.
I try really hard, Jackie. So, yeah. So it was really incidental. It was funny how that kind of came up.
That Piazza paper is one that I cover in one of my classes, and I cover it because it's so interesting to think about how you really should attempt to assess for elopement, and it doesn't really come quite naturally when you try to think about how it should look, right? Because you're like, well, I need them to move out of the environment, but if they move out of the environment, then they're not in the FA anymore.
Right.
So that paper is really clever, and then I have them role play it, and it's always just fun because pretend like this is room A and pretend like this is room B, and now you're going to bolt between the rooms.
That's awesome.
But it's great. It really brings it to life because then they see, oh, now I see how you can sort of mimic the topography of the behavior without the dangerous component of the behavior, and likely it would still fall within the same response class. So it was really cool study if anyone wants to check it out.
So Megan, could you kind of speak to some of the big kind of summary points of that assessment review paper? Because I think most people are probably, when they're thinking about FAs, if they haven't had a chance to read Piazza, they haven't read your lit review or read some of the papers that you reviewed, I mean, probably have that same issue of like elopement. Like, what am I going to do? Well, if they run away, I got to go chase them because it's not safe. Just let them leave. But then I'm giving them all this attention, but I'm not always in the attention condition. And if they run away, well, it kind of ends my entire, the assessment's over. And I really wanted to have them, run away multiple times because that was how I was trained to run, your standard FAs. I want to have these multiple opportunities. And the problem behavior itself just feels like it's this weird catch-22 of, if I assess this behavior, I'm going to have to throw out all my conditions to just maintain safety. But then how am I going to make a good treatment when I can't effectively assess the behavior? So what were some of the big findings that you took from that literature review?
That's kind of the big issue, is how to maintain external validity, mimicking your assessment situation to the natural environment that the child typically is exposed to, but without compromising the integrity of the assessment. And so you hit on one thing that was really kind of central to the elopement issue, but it also is the case with other topographies like flopping to the ground or disrobing or pica, where like you have to bait the environment, or once the behavior happens, you have to reset it if you want to use like response rate as your primary metric. It comes back to, how do you define it initially? Some people get around the issue of having to reset the response by using something like being in a certain area of the classroom. So if reading instruction happens in one corner, and we're going to define elopement as being in an area other than that corner, then you can use something like partial interval recording, and you don't have to reset the opportunity because you can just talk about, percentage of the session spent outside that area. But a lot of people like to use response rate or the occurrence of behavior in some way. So people have used latency FAs. Those have become more popular recently, even since this review, to get around the issue of, well, how do we reset the opportunity for the response to happen? Well, with a latency FA, you start your session and the response happens, you record your latency, you deliver the consequence, and then the session's over. People, since this review, have also used trial-based FAs, which are really similar to the latency in that once the problem behavior happens, you score an occurrence in whatever segment you're in, and then that segment gets terminated. So people have kind of found ways around some of these issues, but I think in any case, like being mindful of what your definition is and what your measurement system is to make sure that they make sense. So you're not using something like a definition of leaving the room, but you're using frequency as your measurement system. So it's like, oh, the kid left the room, that counts as one, but he was outside the room the entire session. But you only scored that one instance. So being mindful of your definitions and your measurement systems.
That's so important, right? Because then you're like, oh, look, you only left the room once. I'm like really killing it as a practitioner. I'm like doing so great, but not really.
Right, exactly.
I'd like to think you'd have that moment of like, wait a minute, something's wrong here.
Yeah. One of the things a few people have done, not many, but it was based on the Piazza paper, the fixed time delivery of prompts. So to equate attention delivery across conditions, because what you were mentioning before about if a child runs and you have to reset the opportunity, then that involves attention delivery. And so a way to get around that is, well, let's just deliver attention on a time-based schedule throughout all of the conditions in the form of prompting the child to remain next to a therapist, which is what some people have done also.
Now, when you were reading some of the reviews where they discussed how they had sort of like that kind of fixed time before they'd kind of move closer to the participant, or they would just go and they would neutrally return the participant back to the space they were in. I think there was one you looked at that I actually had read myself earlier this year when I was looking a little bit into elopement, where they were in a big field and they had everyone set up so no one could run away, and then they lightly bring them back to the area. Did you read any of those and wonder, how did they get the child to come back? Because most of the time when you're assessing elopement as a really serious problem behavior, coming back is a real problem. Like I'm just wondering, how did they do this and then say this was at all neutral? Because it's usually a struggle to get some of the students back. Once they go, it's like you're going to be chasing that kid down, and they're not going to come back. I don't know. That was sort of my read from some of these papers. Like they just sort of kind of brushed it off like it was so easy for them to do. Is that something that you've noticed as well, and I'm just doing it wrong? Or
I think it's one of those things that you don't see reflected in the publication, but when you're running the sessions, you see it. In our 2020 paper, we had that issue a few times where returning the participant from playing with the door, coming back, is basically denied access. So withholding or withdrawing access to a preferred item, if that's the function of elopement. So you're also battling that. And so, yeah, there is some problem behavior that we've definitely seen. That wasn't the main DV. So you don't see that plotted on a graph.
Okay, good.
And I always wonder too, like, did they wait until the students weren't engaging in problem behavior to reset the next session, right? Because wouldn't they just immediately run away again if they were still, feeling the way they were feeling previously?
Yeah, if you had some carryover or something from a previous trial. That's another good point. I'm trying to think. I don't think with elopement I've seen anything like that. It's interesting that you brought that up because our participant also in the 2017 paper, she engaged in some aggression. It was part of a different response class. We assessed and treated it separately, but we also saw some problem behavior in those sessions toward the therapist because she also had aggression maintained by attention. And so we were treating primarily her elopement in that project, but while she was waiting, sometimes she would hit the therapist while she was standing there waiting.
Well, fair.
Because attention was being withheld. So I think that brings up another area for future work is, most of the time the kids we work with don't just engage in one form of problem behavior. They engage in a lot of different forms of problem behavior. And so making sure that we're plotting multiple DVs and to the extent that it's meaningful would be super interesting, I think.
Mm-hmm. Now, in looking at the literature review, you made what I thought was a very fascinating point as to the sort of general trend in terms of function. Because I think when most people think of elopement, they think, oh, well, of course it's escape, right? They're physically, that's what they're doing. They're escaping something. And how so many of the FAs in the research that you looked at were very clear, like we're definitely testing that escape function. And we'll probably test the attention function. We'll probably test some, denied access or some tangible function. And sometimes they just wouldn't even put the automatic, an automatic reinforcement or some sort of an alone test, because of course, why would that be the function of elopement? But the overall results didn't seem to play out to sort of that common sense approach as to, just kind of guessing what the function would be, right?
Totally. That was really surprising to me that the most common function in the published papers that we reviewed was tangibles or activities, followed by attention pretty closely. Because, the immediate outcome of running away is being away. So that was something that was super profound. And sometimes, like in some settings with some practitioners who are not necessarily behaviorally oriented, they'll talk about some topographies in terms of function, like, oh, they engage in a lot of attention-seeking behavior, or they engage in a lot of escape, behavior. And it's like, and then you follow up with, oh, have you done a functional assessment, of those behaviors to show what the function is? And usually it's no, but they're making an assumption about the function based on the topography or some aspect of the situation. But that was super fascinating to me. That positive reinforcement was the most common function.
Well, you're escaping to something, right? And in this case, the something that you're going toward was really, really important.
Mm-hmm.
I always run to important things.
That result makes a lot of sense because, I'm sure at some point in all of our careers, when we heard, like escape maintained behavior, and then we assume, well, the treatment will be just let them get away from that for a while. And then you wonder why your treatment doesn't work when you're sort of like, look, you're in a vacuum because you asked, and you sort of take everything away. You're like, now you don't have to do anything. I don't know about you, teacher. This is boring. I'm going to continue to engage in problem behavior now because, there's always, it's more of an escape too than it is just an escape.
Right. It was like when your vacation feels like more fulfilling when you go somewhere and do activities versus when you just sit at home, right?
Yeah.
Totally.
So given that the overall literature review, the results really were pointing more towards that kind of denied access to the tangibles, I guess you weren't probably too surprised then that it seemed like when you were looking at sort of the statistics, that a functional communication treatment seemed to have kind of the best results overall. What I know I was surprised at, in reading your article, was how many articles just sort of were like, and we're going to use blocking and we're going to use extinction, even though it didn't seem like the results of adding in blocking and extinction were always, that effective. Like it was sort of given that they have to be a part of treatment, but it wasn't necessarily playing out in the results of the papers you reviewed that they had to have been there. Was I sort of reading too much into sort of just the numbers there, or was that sort of something that you were thinking as well?
In our analysis of treatment effects, it was hard for us to make any like really big conclusions just based on how few articles and treatments we did have. I think we had like 23 total or 20 something total. So we didn't have a huge sample size. But given like the form of the behavior, I guess I understand why blocking would be used. And in the work that we've done, it's always super funny the first time elopement does happen in treatment, because it's almost like a reflex, like a child is running away from you and you want to grab them and stop them from running from you. But in our treatments, we try to do them without blocking first. And so if a student is the therapist in the session, I always have to be like, don't follow him, because they're like, they jump, and they try to they want to go after him. It's such a natural thing for us to do as adults when a child is running from us. Extinction, given that we know it influences the effectiveness of FCT, I wasn't like super surprised. But then you think about what extinction for an attention function looks like versus extinction for an escape function. With attention, you just let the child run, which is typically not appropriate. But for escape, extinction is following the child and continuing to present the demand, which it's hard to make a kid do something if you're running after them, but at least you're not putting them into harm's way because you're continuing to follow them.
Mm-hmm. Neither seems ideal.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
So you hope that no one asks to treat the problem behavior of elopement and you don't have to chase anyone down. That's the take home. No, wait, that's not the, I know that's not the take home.
It's a real problem.
It is a real
right
problem.
Now, someone's engaging in are probably getting chased down because you can't risk someone's safety. Mm-hmm. So there's got to be a better way. And luckily, Megan researched.
Mm-hmm.
Megan, have you ever thought about having whoever the therapist is running the sessions, like practice not making that reflex before you run the sessions? Because even maybe that like jerk forward motion that you have when you're going to go run after someone, I wonder if even that could maintain elopement.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good point. During assessment, we're really good at regulating consequences. And most of the time during a functional analysis, I try to be the therapist as much as I can, especially with severe behavior. And it can be really challenging, especially if you're talking about elopement. It's not something that we usually train for, but that's a really good point. I'm pretty sure we do some kind of just super quick and dirty behavioral skills training before our sessions with the students, just to prepare them for what they'll be doing. Most of the students, when they're working with me in the clinic, they're with me for a while with a variety of children and cases. But yeah, that's a really good point.
I know that I would have to work on it, right? Like I'd be like, don't move. That would be like my internal verbal behavior.
I think you're also, depending on the location you're in, the environment you're running your assessment or running your treatment, there's so many kind of social variables to take into play because I'm mostly in schools. So as much as I could know, I'm doing an assessment and I need to do the following and I'll behave a certain way and I'll respond a certain way because it's part of my assessment. But anyone else sees a student like running out of a classroom, it's, they're calling everyone, they're running after them. They're, what's wrong? How can I help you? And it's like, oh, you've ruined it all, everybody. And I'll wear like a sign, assessment in progress sometimes.
Yes. So that's super funny because when we did these studies, we were in our university affiliated building, and the building used to be a bank. So it's a super old building and it's very strange. There are very strange pockets of places in this building. But whenever we were running sessions, I'd have colleagues walk by, and I'm the only behavior analyst in the department. So I've got counselors and people in leadership. And so they'd be walking by and there's a girl just running up and down the hallway. Like, don't worry about it. Like, we're doing research. It's okay. Or
We're
our
working
other,
on it.
yeah. Like,
Nothing to see here, folks. Nothing to see here. Just keep walking.
yeah.
Oh, boy. Now, when you were describing doing the literature review, was the literature review itself very impactful in terms of how you then, over your next couple, either clients or participants, sort of thought about doing your assessment and then thought about what treatments you thought would, make the most sense to start with? Or were you sort of doing all of this at once? Like you just had a number of participants, you were doing your literature review, and you sort of were, responding with what you knew and what research you had and had available at the time. Because I know reading your articles, it definitely felt like each one, you sort of took what you learned in the previous one, looked at what was current in the research now, in line with sort of your goals as a practitioner, as well as a researcher, and sort of just took everything to the next level and then add this component and removed this piece that probably seemed extraneous based on other reviews. I'd love to hear just the overall process that sort of went into the development of the next two assessments, or the next few assessments, I should say.
Yeah, for sure. So the results of the review, going even back further and reading the literature, definitely informed how we structured the FA. So I think in sequence, we did the project that was published in 2017 first. So next, after we did the lit review. And so we incorporated the fixed time prompting procedure that Piazza did. And then I think there was one paper in the lit review that did that also. I really liked that procedure. Not having to mess with a retrieval procedure, but doing fixed time prompts. I really like that. So we definitely incorporated that into the 2017 paper. And then the 2021, I've gotten more interested in using latency FAs and trial-based FAs, ones that terminate after the first instance of behavior. People have been making the case that latency FAs can be really great with elopement because of the nature of the response. And so that's why we utilized the latency FA in the 2020 paper. I'd been working with that child for a few years, and we'd done an indirect functional assessment with his mom, and we had been seeing elopement from him immediately preceding and following our other clinical sessions. And it was pretty clear to us what the function was. So I wanted to do an FA pretty quickly that would demonstrate a functional relation, and a latency FA was like perfect for that.
Excellent. Well, why don't we take a short break, and then when we come back, let's talk about those two articles and get into the nitty-gritty of the assessment and the following treatment. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
And we are back talking with Dr. Megan Boyle about elopement. But before we get into more of Dr. Boyle's research, I wanted to remind our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. By listening to this show, you are able to earn 1 learning credit. Huzzah! All you need to do is finish listening to the episode, then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com/get-CEUs, GET-CEUS, and enter in some information, including 2 secret code words that we've hidden throughout the episode. We were very fortunate to get some code words this week from our special guest. And the first of those code words is dancing. dancing. Dancing is the act of movement, possibly to music, or dancing for yourself, or dancing like nobody's watching. Or the Billy Idol song, Dancing with
Ooh,
Myself.
I like that, Rob.
Or Dancing in the Dark, which is almost the title of that Bjork movie. Anyone see that one? I heard it was super depressing.
It was very depressing.
But I don't know why. I don't know why I ended on that example because they're having a grand old time here. But anyway, what's another dancing?
Footloose.
Footloose. That doesn't say dancing in the title. Though.
I know, but it's about dancing.
You know, if you're watching The King and I, you could be watching that song about dancing all night. Remember that one? That's a good song.
I don't actually, because I don't watch musicals or anything for that matter.
That's a classic, Jackie. You gotta. Okay. Anyway, dancing. And let's get back. I'm sure. Oh no, I hope Megan's still here. She didn't get too bored with my overlong keyword there.
That was awesome. I loved it.
Okay, good. That's what I bring to the show. Not any research, just my ability to talk about keywords for 40 minutes. So we talked about your literature review. So you now have all the knowledge that there is from that 15-year period in the behavior analytic field on how elopement has been assessed and how elopement has been treated. And in your next two articles, you have two very different participants who have very different treatments that come out of your assessments. You have Abby, who sounded like a very busy young lady. And then there was also Aaron, who you mentioned right before the break was a student that you've been working with as a clinician for a while and had some, very kind of specific elopement type, topography elopement that really lent itself to the use of like the latency FA. So why don't we start talking about your work with Abby, and then we'll talk about the one with Aaron as well. But I'd love to just hear in detail, how did you come up with the FA design? And then how did you come up with the ideas for the treatments? Because they were so very different. There were a lot of similarities between the two participants, but it was like so many neat variables that just felt very much like you pulled them out of all this research that you looked at and put them in place, and they just worked so well, especially with Abby, ones I don't think I ever would have thought of based on reviewing research.
Yeah, now that you mentioned that, I'm really realizing like, wow, the FAs were super different and the treatments were super different, like in multiple ways.
I mean, when you're living it, you're probably just like, all right, we're working on this problem. You're looking at that data every day. You're seeing the change, and you're just like, all right, let's keep helping, keep working with these individuals, and you're just seeing these great results. But then when you're just someone who's reading them from afar, it's like, wow, these titles are so different. You already kind of get that.
Yeah. Well, so with Abby, so she was 6. She had autism, and like you said, she was very busy. Yeah, she engaged in several topographies of problem behavior. We did an indirect assessment with her mom to identify conditions to include in our FA. So I think we had potentially automatic reinforcement, attention, and escape that popped up on the interview. So we wanted to evaluate all of them. And I was really inspired by the fixed time prompting procedure that was used by Piazza and in another paper, I can't remember the author, but to control for the delivery of attention that might happen if you're trying to retrieve a participant. So the fixed time procedure is basically every session is kind of broken down into intervals. And at those prescribed intervals, kind of regardless of what's happening, you deliver the prompt to stay by the therapist. So as the therapist, when a certain prompt is scheduled to be delivered, you move close to the participant and then you deliver the prompt, stay by me, or something like that, regardless of the condition. So even if you're in escape or you're in ignore, to allow the opportunity for elopement to be consistent across conditions and to not require you to be retrieving the participant.
That is so clever.
Yeah, it is.
Right?
I wish I could take credit for that. I definitely cannot, but it's super clever.
Wow.
In watching that, because I know when I read it, I'm imagining the therapist like sidling up
Yep,
to the child.
Like,
okay.
Yep.
Like they're like behind a bush, like they're a cartoon character. They just like jump out, they're like, hey, stay by me now.
Yes, that's exactly how it looked. Like it was very discreet and she was usually, I don't know, engaged in whatever she was doing. And so it wasn't an issue with her, but I could see that could be an issue with some kids. They're looking around like, what are you doing? But yeah, it wasn't an issue with her.
You have your fixed time as part of your assessment, which takes away a lot of the problems we were discussing that really could come up when you're trying to assess elopement. And her results seemed pretty complicated.
Yes. Yep. So we looked at elopement, and then we also looked at her requests. So one of the things I was concerned about was the ignore condition. And that's something that people had incorporated in the past, but people don't really talk about like the ramifications or the implications of what that means. So ignore conditions in an FA or alone conditions assess for maintenance by non-social stimuli, non-social consequences. So with elopement, it's like, well, what does that mean? So that would mean that the sensory stimuli produced by running are actually maintaining the behavior. And because we were using fixed time prompts, we wanted to rule out some kind of adventitious reinforcement by our prompt delivery. So there were some times where she kind of turned around, she's like, are you going to get me? Or what are you doing? So we wanted to make sure that that wasn't being confounded with attention in our ignore condition. So we thinned the delivery of those prompts by 15 seconds and also collected data on her requests to chase her. I mean, I'm pretty convinced that she was discriminating the contingencies because she wasn't requesting at all in the ignore condition anymore at the end of our assessment. So I believe she was discriminating the contingency that, contingent attention was not available in the ignore condition, and she was continuing to elope. But I know I've talked to some other people about this, and they have had some other interpretations of the data that, no, it's not automatically maintained, and it's probably attention and escape. But I think that brings up an interesting kind of issue with respect to assessing elopement and including an ignore or an alone condition. Some people have said, well, if your definition is exceeding a certain distance from a therapist or running away from somebody, then you can't talk about it being automatic because there's another person involved. But it's like, I've seen kids during my doc program. I think of one specific child, like specifically, we would go outside and he would elope. But when he ran, he kind of skipped and he had long hair and he like waved his head back and forth and he had his eyes closed. And it's like, there's so many stimuli that are produced by engaging in that behavior. So, and people who engage in physical activity do so because it's automatically reinforcing, at least in part. So I don't see why. I don't know, especially when the data are pretty convincing, at least for me.
I do know how he feels. It's really nice to skip in the wind with long hair, right? So I agree with you that it could potentially be automatically maintained, at least partially, right?
Yeah.
But also nice to go jogging and escape your family sometimes.
Hashtag my life.
Yeah, and I would think too that just because, well, someone's nearby, they might change the behavior of the individual. I think could also speak to just how complicated human behavior is and how much we try to control every aspect in our FA, but there are just going to be components that you can't fully control, or there are just going to be cues that are just going to somehow change behavior, and there's not much we can do about it. And to drill down anymore, then I think the extra work that you did in your assessment really starts getting to be, like, what are we trying to prove here? We're trying to help an individual. We're not necessarily trying to like solve every possible minute problem.
I think it can get really hard to parse apart, right? So if you have behavior that you like to engage in that really just for you, so we would call it automatically maintained, but you can best access it when no one else is around, then by necessity you may need to escape from something else and then access that behavior.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's a really good point.
So you had the additional alone sessions with that extended time, and you felt pretty confident with your FA results. So now it was time to develop a treatment. And I was very interested, where did the idea to use rules as a treatment addition to the program? Like, did that come from work, with Abby, that you knew that she tended to follow rules? Was that something that you just thought would be a good addition to try to avoid needing as much, either extinction or blocking in the final treatment analysis?
Yeah, I mean, thinking back, and I was trying to think about this, I don't really use rules a whole lot in my work, trying to eliminate as many extraneous prompts or antecedents as I can, especially like difficulties fading verbal prompts. But I think her verbal repertoire was emerging even in the course of having worked with her for a few months. It was becoming more and more sophisticated. She was a blast. And I think we were thinking we were going to have to do some kind of component analysis or treatment package. And it was like, well, if we incorporate a rule together with some kind of token economy or something, why don't we just evaluate the effects of the rule on its own first, just to show that on its own, the rule didn't work. I wasn't expecting the rule to work. So it was pretty surprising to us that it did, at least that the criteria we were able to evaluate. It was definitely one of those moments where, as we were doing these sessions and it was working, we kind of looked at each other and we're like, I can't believe that this is working. But it's an empirical question whether or not it would. And she just stood there and like looked at us, and yeah.
One thing I really love about that, though, is it's so applicable, right? Like the mom, like that's what you would say in real life, right? Like, stay by me. And then whatever, like when it's okay to run, you can run. It seems like the easiest, the most parsimonious treatment that like a parent could follow. So they're not going to have to like get out all their token boards and get, like a parent's like going to the store, doesn't have to get other things, right? I just thought that was like really elegant. And by the way, your graph is amazing.
Thank you.
It is a beautiful example of a changing criterion design.
Changing criterion designs have like fascinated me because teaching research methods, like the situations in which you can use those are kind of limited.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And it's so hard to find a good example of one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And we were able to use one here. It was super cool.
You did all the things, the extra things that you need to do to demonstrate functional control.
Yes.
And you're changing criterion design, which includes reversing back to a previous criterion level and varying the length of each of the criterion sessions. So
that's what I was going to say.
Great job, Dr. Boyle.
Thank you. I don't think many people appreciate the changing criterion design, but we found it pretty useful.
I just love it for the fact that anytime I have a supervisee, they're like, when do you use changing criterion? I now have like 2 articles that aren't like the 2 that I've been saving from my own days in grad school. Like, I think these are 2. It's like, now we've got some new ones that actually are dealing with problems that, you might see, as opposed to this is research from way back in the dark ages when changing criterions were all the rage with the Lindy Hop and those penny farthing bicycles or whatever they seemed more popular.
They were ever popular.
They were never popular. Well, here we got 2 good examples of. So would you mind describing, Megan, just a little bit about what the changing criterion was in terms of the use of rules? I mean, you pretty much set up a DRI procedure.
Mm-hmm. I wrestled with calling this DRI or DRO.
Mm-hmm.
Don't call it a DRO.
Yeah,
I'm
Jackie
just kidding.
will turn your microphone off right now if you call it a DRO and sing its praises.
Because it's like stay by me is just the absence of elopement. But like, yes, it is also incompatible with elopement. So I don't know why specifically it was like, oh, it's DRI, but that seemed to work because yes, technically standing by somebody is incompatible with eloping.
You could start moving. If I started moving all over the place, like the individual can't just be like, well, I won't do anything. They have to move with me at some point, or if they don't, want to be engaging in elopement. I guess I'd be eloping from them technically, but
yes. Mm-hmm. So we gave the rule, stay by me and then you can run. And then the therapist started a timer. When the timer elapsed, the therapist then said, okay, you can go ahead and run. And so the dotted lines on the figure denote those time-based criteria. So for the most part, there were a few sessions where she ran before we told her that she could. But for the most part, she did wait until the therapist said, okay, you can go ahead and run. So
not many.
Yeah, not many. There were, I think 1, 2, there were 5.
Yeah, which is not many out of 80, right? I mean, like...
Yeah, that's not many. There was that, because we didn't implement blocking in this study. So it was kind of like when that first session happened where she did run, it was kind of like, uh-oh. Did she just experience now that like we're not going to block her or prevent her from doing that? But that was also a good test of what our procedure actually was. Because if she hadn't run, then we couldn't really say that we successfully implemented a procedure without blocking. I mean, technically we did, but if she never contacted the fact that elopement wouldn't get blocked, then it's not as impressive.
Were there going to be next steps for this? Because I know in the article, there's sort of that lamentation of, and then the term ended and G left and the end of the research. Because it did seem, one of the downsides was that in terms of the latency, you'd gotten to some great results, but it probably wasn't going to be where like mom or dad or another caregiver would need it to be to feel, 100% safe or more safe.
Yeah, that's one of the things about having an outpatient, clinic is that we're really limited sometimes with some of these kids. But we probably would have looked at extending the criterion or incorporating mom herself into the sessions or modifying the treatment and getting some data from applied settings, when they do go to the grocery store. Although mom had said that she had been incorporating this kind of incidentally, like at the grocery store, for example, that's one that comes to mind because there are aisles at the grocery store. And Abby's thing was running up and down aisles or like in a bookstore or something. So the grocery store was really hard because she would always want to run. And mom started doing the whole, like, if you stay by me, we can run after. And then after they would go to the grocery store, she would take her to like an enclosed field and let her go and run around.
Oh, that's
awesome.
Great.
That is so awesome.
I know. It was so awesome. I wish I had some kind of like applied data to show that. But it was super cool to hear that. It's always really cool to hear that what we're doing is really impacting their lives outside of our sessions.
That's great. That's a little bit in, not exactly contrast, but your next study with Aaron, in that you did have the time to do that sort of extension with the family member in terms of making sure that elopement would not occur for these longer periods of time. But before we get to that, let's go back and talk about his FA, because that used a latency FA and sort of took the form of like a test control that you might find in, say, an ISCA, correct?
Yep. It's funny that you said that, the ISCA, because I've done some stuff with the ISCA too. And Josh Jessel was the AE on this paper. So I got to talk to him and he had wanted to incorporate kind of the ISCA terminology into this.
Nice. We had him on to talk about latency FAs.
He talked about that article, actually, the one with the water, the latency to water play. Sorry, it's fun to read that. I was like, I know that article.
Yes, I always tell my students to like try to remember the references as best they can, because they feel so awesome when you read a paper and then they cite something and you're like, oh yeah, like you can feel really smart because you know that paper,
Comes full circle.
That is one of the secret joys of like reading enough research articles, because they all start to kind of refer to each other and like, wait a minute, I know what they're talking about because I read that. Yeah, that is a fun bonus.
Yes, or when they incorrectly talk about a paper, that feels extra good because then you're like, no, that's not what happened in that paper, and then you pull it out and you read it and you're like, huh, it happens sometimes, not super frequently, but we know it does happen.
I know. So with Aaron, you took a lot of, I think, what was in that paper in terms of that paper was in a latency FA for elopement to water play. But with Aaron, it was elopement to door play.
Yes. I was definitely inspired by the Jessel paper. And there was the Falcomata paper in 2010 also. That is like one of my just random like favorite papers because it's super kind of simple and elegant. And unique in that it was elopement maintained by access to door play. But at this time, I was super into like latency as an arrangement. And like I said, we had a pretty good hypothesis about why his elopement was happening. I mean, when it was specifically when he would get to the clinic and we would be talking to his caregiver. And it's kind of like, well, what did we expect him to do, really? It's one of the things I try to tell my students, like, don't expect kids left alone to just do appropriate things.
Fair.
We're not giving him any instructions right now. We're not, engaging him, or he doesn't have access to a preferred item. So yeah, there are doors everywhere. So we would watch him and he would like look around for a door and then he would just run to it and start playing with it. So wanted, like I said, just an efficient way of demonstrating that before we went to treatment.
I do love how you took it into account, Aaron's love of doors in the treatment, in terms of asking which door he would like to earn or to use as part of the final treatment package. That was such a nice touch, because I'm sort of reading it through. I'm like, yeah, you let him play with a door. Okay, so you're in your little room and he's got one door, but he had access to all the doors. I mean, there must have been doors everywhere.
Yes, there were doors everywhere. And it was interesting because I think we tried keeping it to a few doors that were around the clinic area. The building has like 4 floors. And so we would, in the past, kind of just go on walks, like breaks between our regular sessions, and he'd find a new door and he'd play with that door. And before all of these treatment sessions and the FA too, when you're doing FCT, you want to make sure that the reinforcer that you're working with is really valuable at that moment. Otherwise, it's kind of pointless to be doing FCT with an item that's not valuable at that moment. So sometimes we would be, getting ready for our sessions and putting the tape on the floor to denote the elopement criterion. And he would just kind of stop and look at us. And it's like, what's up? And he's like, can we go to another door? I was like, okay. And I mean, his language was also getting more and more sophisticated, but he struggled with some intraverbals and especially talking about things in their absence, like when they're not there. So it was like, okay, let's just print off pictures of the doors that we've seen him interact with and just do a little picture preference assessment before our session. So,
because he probably had one specific door in mind, but trying to be able to explain to someone else which door that was.
Oh, I don't think I could explain to someone
right.
a preferred door in an environment like that. That's very
have
complex.
To know like a lot of
architectural language.
Yeah, or what floor it's on. So initially it was like, hey, just show me. Like, just take me there. Show me. And he could lead us there. But it was like, okay, there has to be a better way. So let's just use pictures. And so it was his face lit up the first time we showed him the pictures of all the doors.
Oh,
He was like, oh my gosh. It's like, yeah, buddy, now you can just show us like with the pictures.
So did you find that there were any surprises in terms of the final treatment? I mean, you have your latency FA, you've got your tester control conditions. Look, nothing ever happens during the control. Look, lots happens during the test. And then you started your FCT. That was almost immediately effective at decreasing the rates of elopement, increasing the number of FCRs. And then you used the delay thinning procedure that I think we've talked about before on the show. But would you mind describing sort of what the key components of the delay thinning procedure you used were?
Sure. So we did FCT and then we did tolerance training, which is pretty common with what the Hanley group does after they do FCT. So on some trials, during FCT, our sessions were, I think, like 5 minutes. And then when we went to tolerance training and then the reinforcement thinning, our sessions were trial-based. They weren't time-based. They were 5 trials. On some of those trials, we would deny his request. So we would say, not right now. So he would emit his functional communication response, can I play with the door? And we'd say, not right now. And then the tolerance response was breathing slowly in and out and saying, okay. And then after that, he mastered those super quickly. And then the reinforcement thinning was that DRO-based contingency delay. So on 2 of the 5 trials, we reinforced his FCR right away. So he would ask to play with the door and we'd say, yep, okay, go play. And then the next trial, we'd bring him back. And these were quasi-randomly arranged. And then for the other 3, we would deny the FCR and say, not right now. For, I think, 2 of them, we had a DRO-based contingency delay. So he would say, can I play with the door? We would say, no, not right now. He would breathe in and out slowly. Okay. And then the therapist would start a timer to initiate the time-based criterion. So if he ran before we gave him permission, he would get 3 seconds access to the door. But if he waited until the therapist said, yep, go ahead, then he got a minute access to the door.
And by the 3-second access to the door, you're just referring to the fact that there was no way to stop him from getting at least some access to the door. It was just sort of like a minimum amount of time that he just would have it before he could sort of, okay, come on, we're going back over to where we started.
Yeah, we had talked to his caregiver before while we were designing the treatment. And we had talked about the issues with response blocking and extinction. It can be really hard to block a child when they're running. You might not see them take off. And she's like, yep, exactly. So I said, when he does run and you are not able to stop him and he gets to a door, how long is it before you typically remove him? And she says, oh, it's about 3 seconds. So that's kind of how we came up with the 3 seconds anyway, was, all right, well, what's typically happening?
Mm-hmm. And in that regard, you weren't using blocking because you weren't keeping him from accessing the door. You just were making the magnitude of reinforcement or duration of reinforcement much smaller comparatively to if he reached, whatever the criterion happened to be for the trial you were on.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I think that this is so smart because often if you're talking about running through that involves blocking as a means of implementing extinction, then there's always the caveat that, oh, well, this has to be implemented with 100% fidelity for it to work, right? And maybe you can achieve that in some really controlled setting, but in the real world, no, it's not going to happen, right? You're never going to have this 100% fidelity. So by building in what you've done here, Megan, you've acknowledged, right? Like, this is not going to happen where we're effectively able to prevent him from accessing the door if he does bolt. So you just keep it as short as possible, and it's so much more realistic, I think. And then you're going to know better if this is a treatment that could actually work in the environment.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the longer that I do this kind of work, the more mindful I am about what caregivers and teachers and other people are really able to do, and one of the things that I'm trying to do better is make it so that I'm kind of building those things into the treatments from the beginning as well as I can. And then when it does get time to, train a caregiver or assess for generalization or whatever, that we don't have to modify treatment so much because we've kind of built those things in.
And unlike with Abby, you did have a chance to do that kind of an extension probe with mom for Aaron, right?
Yes. And that was something that I really wanted to build in kind of after the study with Abby. We did a few probes with Abby in other areas of the building, but it wasn't to the extent that they were with Aaron. So the thing with elopement is it's just so difficult and tedious to be arranging these sessions. Like, you're not just sitting in the clinic room,
Mm-hmm.
You're out in other parts of the building. So wanting to make sure that mom could kind of be a part of those sessions as much as possible.
I was struck by looking at the treatment graph. You'd gotten to about, I think, 45 to 50 seconds in terms of your reinforcer thinning procedures. But then in your extensions, you'd have 5 to 10 minute sessions with, mom involved or a therapist involved, where Aaron was able to wait. Was that surprising to you? Because I know for me, when I look at graphs, I get very rigid in terms of, well, the numbers say 50 seconds. So if I go to 5 minutes, it's going to fail because that's how numbers work. That's too big a number change. Or just based on sort of having known Aaron for a while, it seemed reasonable that he would reach that goal, even though you hadn't necessarily built him up to that goal, all the way during the treatment trials.
We kind of treated it as one of those we'll see what happens. Especially, with the study with Abby and just working with kids in general, you can have a plan, but you really need to have 50 plans because your first, 49 probably won't work for whatever reason. And then just not knowing, the degree to which what you did is going to generalize. I mean, we did do them in the same building. So there was a degree of, I think, stimulus control with the building. We were there during the sessions too. So I think we tried to incorporate his mom, or we did on at least some of them, but I think there was at least one where his mom wasn't able to be there. Mm-hmm. So there was kind of stimulus control with us. I think, a more authentic test might have been if they were somewhere else, outside of the building, if we weren't there. But I think for whatever reason, what we had done with treatment just did generalize to the probes. On the first probe, he did elope a few times, but then we did a few more treatment sessions and he didn't, which was just amazing. We were also really surprised.
Well, Megan, this has been a great review of your work, both the past work and your literature review, and then the actual practice. How could you put all of what you've learned, both in your own work and in the literature review into practice? So I think this is a great time for us to move into the dissemination station section of the show. Oh, we're here. Oh,
sounds weirder in this microphone. I need to use a bigger microphone, so I make a bigger train sound.
Oh, I was telling Diana we need to devote more than just the place where we have dinner to be our studio, and then we can really get some killer sound effects in this production. But at least for today, Jackie, we are always glad to have your Foley effects. So, Megan, we've talked a lot about the history of treatment for elopement, your recent work with elopement. And I mean, you kind of know where this is going to go in terms of talking to practitioners or sending out a message about elopement and its treatment to practitioners. I would just love to hear, what are kind of the golden rules you've picked up in the assessment And then after that, sort of the golden rules in terms of what you would recommend for treatment or things to think about when it comes to treatment, knowing that every case is going to be different.
So going back to what we had talked about at the very beginning, as far as making sure your measurement system makes sense with the definitions that you've picked. So really sitting back and thinking like, okay, if we're using some kind of discrete response, what's our retrieval procedure going to look like? Making sure that how big of a confound is that? Should we use something like partial interval instead of frequency or rate? Safety is always the biggest priority. So making sure that you're arranging, if you're in a position where you're able to do an FA, making sure that your environment is arranged so that there's no way that this child could get hurt, if and when they do elope, because you do want problem behavior happening during your assessment. I think one thing that I've been mulling over for a few years, and it's one of those things where I mean to go back and read some of these papers again, when I have the spare time, but I just don't have time ever, is making sure that we're arranging our treatment situations in a way that's not artificially inflating our treatment outcomes. So when you're talking about treating a tangible function, for example, with something like aggression, all you do is take the item away from the person and hold it next to you, out of their reach, but within sight. But with elopement, it doesn't make sense to do that if the typical situation is they see something far away and run to it, and then if your treatment looks like, oh, I'm just going to take the item away and put it next to me. Oh, they're not eloping at all during these sessions. Well, maybe that's because, but it's something that's been on my mind. We did a treatment evaluation recently. We haven't published it yet, but it was in a preschool classroom. And our treatment, one of the functions that we got was access to tangibles. And one of the things I had to really remind the student who was running these sessions was, when the sessions begin, remember to put the item away from him, but within sight. So it's one of those things I mean to go back and kind of look at some of the procedures of these papers to see whether they're doing that in these tangible conditions. It's a little bit different with attention and escape. Those considerations maybe aren't there at least as much. But then you also have, and this is another thing I've been thinking about, the direct access tangible versus like socially mediated tangible. Mm-hmm. So a situation where a kid sees something across the street and runs to it versus a kid who has a history of running away because mom takes out her phone from her purse and gives it to him. Mm-hmm. And so like idiosyncrasies and just like treating and assessing the tangible function mm-hmm. that we don't necessarily think about.
Yeah, very good point. I think some of it, like you said, it's that rethinking what is elopement and really staying on the function of elopement rather than, I think that kind of classic, topography. Well, if they're going away, it means this, like that. I don't think I learned that in graduate school, but why do I assume that that's what happens when I'm, not taking a test about functions of behavior? That's different. So it's a very good point. Another question I had in terms of treatment, I know that the number of published papers on the treatment of elopement is not so exhaustive that you could make any, grand statement about, what is the solid evidence, the 100% evidence-based. But do you feel that there is enough information out there, both from your own practice, from the research that you've reviewed, and as well as written, that we don't need to start with a blocking or extinction procedure when we're putting our treatments in place? Or is that still really come down to just the safety of the individual in terms of the topography of their elopement?
That's a really good question. I mean, you're balancing safety and wanting to produce quick reductions in behavior with like manageability of implementing these interventions. One approach that I'm kind of evaluating right now is, well, let's start off without implementing blocking or extinction. Mm-hmm. Let's just do straight up FCT. And then if it doesn't work, then we'll look at incorporating one of those other procedures. And like in general, I think, if you're evaluating a treatment, do it at 100% intensity, like, a continuous reinforcement schedule with no delay, because that'll tell you if at its core, the intervention that you picked will work. And then you go into schedule thinning from there. Mm-hmm. But with blocking and extinction, they're just, especially blocking, it's just such an intense procedure to ask people to implement.
An experience.
An experience, yeah. If it's working through punishment, for example, like, are we really aware that we could be implementing punishment? You know what I mean? Like, we've looked at how blocking works through what mechanism. So, like, just keep in mind that that's kind of a punishment procedure. So maybe, I don't know, kind of the mind of let's do it without those things first and then see where we go from there. In this recent data set, we treated 2 functions. Actually, this little guy had 2 functions of elopement. We started off FCT for both of them. We had to incorporate blocking for one of the functions, but not the other one. So that was also something that was super interesting.
So it doesn't sound like your work with elopement is ending anytime soon, or you checked it off the list of like, no more elopement, please. I've done all there is to be done. There's still more work to do.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I don't want to say there's more variability in the situations compared to other response forms like aggression, but like it kind of seems that there are. I mean, you've got kids who, or maybe it's just a difference in severity, kids who leave the classroom but don't go outside versus kids who leave their homes. A kid that we recently worked with left his home, ran down the street, and then got into a lake. So that's, intense, very intense. Or a child who's in a classroom jumping out a window. Like the situations are so different that I think it's maybe harder to conceptualize the assessment and treatment process than other more common, or not even common, but other more typical response forms.
Personally, I would love to see more research or in treatment for like the school setting, like you were mentioning, just the students who are like, I'm leaving this space now, and just trying to control what happens, because I'll go to lots of different buildings, and sometimes it's like, well, they left, I don't know what to do, there's nothing to do, and then there's eyes on a student, but there's no sense of trying to then say, well, you can't go do something fun, or what are they even doing? So you can't even get that information. Some are, if you leave that classroom, you're going to talk to the principal. And there's always that question of, do they want to talk to the principal? How good a conversationalist is the principal? Maybe this is way too reinforcing. And the idea of like, how are you going to assess these variables in these real world settings? Are we really going to set up like the same activity and the principal's only available some of the time and not other times? So like, what else could we do to sort of get to the bottom of some of these other elopement questions? Because then most people say, oh, they just leave because they're running away from whatever I made them do, the work. But then, reading your work, it's like, well, there's a good chance that's not actually what's happening here. It's just what it looks like to someone who's not trained in the functions of behavior.
Yeah. And another one additional thing is I want to know, I mean, this would entail like some survey research, which is really not my area, but like wondering what kinds of protocols are in place in school settings for elopement. Like the people that I've talked to, and some of my students who are teachers in classrooms, say like there might be behavior plans in place for things like aggression or self-injury, but like elopement isn't part of that treatment plan. Like it's just crisis management. So it's just, we lock the doors and we always have someone within 5 feet of him or something. But we've never really assessed it, which I think is its own problem.
Likely what happens is probably idiosyncratic by teacher, but it also could be a function of the need for safety for students, but also sort of what the expectation is for autonomous moving about within the building based on the age of the student. Well, I'm just interested, I guess, now that you brought it up. Oh, there are so many factors.
Yeah.
Good old elopement. Okay, so I hope you didn't come on to tell us, nope, I'm done. Elopement's over. We solved it, everybody, because now we've got all these other questions we have to answer. Oh boy, isn't that the way?
Definitely not over.
Megan, I'm going to say, if you keep up kind of all these lines of research, you could wake up very soon and sort of be like the elopement person that everyone like, come talk about elopement. We need you to talk about elopement. So we're super excited that we had you on the show so we can say we knew you when.
Yay. Well, that's so exciting. And like some people, like in some of these papers, not the ones that we reviewed, but other ones, people will include elopement in a like in another response class. Like, oh, we assessed aggression, self-injury, and elopement. But then when they describe their FA procedures, they don't describe any like of the considerations, that we talked about. Right. So it's also interesting to me, like, well, what are people doing? Or are they just not seeing that specific response form in their FA, for example?
I think you are the elope person, Megan. So
that's so exciting.
Unless it's too stressful to have to talk about elopement so much that you end up eloping yourself. Oh no. You got too deep in your research. Well, Megan, it has been such a pleasure having you on the show tonight. If listeners would like to reach out to you to either ask about this research or, to get pointed to other elopement articles that might be specific to work that they're doing, is there contact information that you're comfortable sharing?
Yeah, I can give you my email address. It's just my name, Megan Boyle, at missouristate.edu. I'd be happy to talk about, any of this stuff with anybody.
Excellent. Guess that wraps up our show on elopement. And before our listeners elope, we should probably end the show nicely because they can't really use FCT through their radios or podcast players to us. So before we finally wrap up, though, a couple pieces of housekeeping. I want to make sure everyone gets that second secret code word, and it is monkey, Monkey. Now, you might think that was picked by Dr. Boyle because she loves monkeys or has a pet monkey, but no, Megan, where did the monkey code word actually come from?
I have a cat named Monkey, and he's actually following me around the house right now because it's time for them to eat, and they've been harassing me for the last 45 minutes. And he's like, he heard you say that. He's right here next to me. He's like, well, where did that come from?
Uh-oh, sorry, Monkey. Don't worry, we're almost done. So, Monkey. Well, again, want to say big thanks to Dr. Megan Boyle for coming on the show. Thanks to Jackie and Diana as well for being such fabulous co-hosts. And of course, thanks to you, the listener, for listening to ABA Inside Track. If you like the show, we would very much love it if you subscribed. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever, Amazon Music, whatever their system is, Stitcher, and wherever you want to get your podcast. Please, we really also love it if you left us a review of the show on any of those places to let us know what you think. There are a couple other ways you can reach out to us. There's certainly social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and Instagram as ABA Inside Track. You can also go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, for CEs and for links to all of the articles discussed in today's episodes. And you can find these episodes coming out on YouTube with the YouTube subtitling feature as well. We also have launched, launched for a little while now, our Patreon, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where you can subscribe to get access to additional social meetups as well as additional book club episodes. Well, I think we'll have our first one coming out pretty soon for patrons only, I think later this month. Ooh-ah. And of course, you can always feel free to email us at any time at abainsidetrack@gmail.com. Big thanks also to so many people who help us make this show, to Dr. Jim Carr for his intro and outro recording, Kyle Sturry for his interstitial music, to Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his editing work, and to Hollis Irvin of the Sycamore Workshop for his visual design. All right, folks. Well, I guess that brings us to the end of the show. Big thanks again to Dr. Boyle for being here. And with that, we're going to say goodbye, but we'll be back next week with another full-length episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye.
Gotta go.
Bye.